So one of the things that I see happening at the moment within a number of public sector or what we call the commons, in a sense, in a sort of an attack on the commons is happening at the moment. And by the commons, I mean the things like education and healthcare, the judicial system and so forth, law enforcement, which should rightly, I think, be owned by the people. I don't say that in some sort of communist way. I mean that in the sense of, in order to have an inclusive educational healthcare system, we need that to be devoid of commercial private interest. The metrics of capitalism and the metrics of the private sector are really about shareholder value. And probably that's quite right. Maybe they should be in terms of having competition in the private sector. But when you apply that to education, what happens is that privatization really depends on standardization, and standardization is the opposite of personalization. Now, despite what you might hear from technology companies, it's very difficult to write computer software that personalizes learning. And I think where the confusion comes from is, one, because the language personalized learning has been hijacked by the technology sector. But also I think we get confused because we're used to the sort of customization or personalization of things like Amazon and so forth, which is really not the same thing. What I mean by personalization is the relationship between people. So the relationship between a practitioner, a teacher, who is experienced and qualified, who knows and learns about the individual ever continually changing needs, passions, aptitudes, and so forth of the children or the students within the cohort. So that's where teaching is a craft. There's clearly some science associated to teaching, but inevitably it's a craft, and you would want artisans to be performing that craft with children. Certainly I would with my children, and I think most people would if they had the choice. But what we're seeing now, I think, is a sort of a result of industrialization of the education structure. And of course it's a big challenge, is how do we provide a consistent standard, a high standard of education to a large population of students, and how do we do that in an affordable manner and so forth. And so what we've been doing is, I think, certainly over the last, probably more intensive over the last 10 years, maybe, but really it's been a sort of over the last 30 years, we've been moving towards a sort of tyranny of measurement. In fact, actually, those that are involved in measurement would call it assessment, but assessment isn't the same thing as measurement. But again, this is a word that's been hijacked by technocrats and bureaucrats, because if you want to know whether a child is learning or a student is learning, that's actually quite easy. You talk to them, you be with them, you listen to them. That's how you know whether a child is learning or your child is learning. So measurement is something very different. And so what's happened is that we look at the measurement industry or the assessment industry, and it's a multi-billion dollar business, and it's run by large multinational corporations. The result of having measurement as the goal, as the purpose of education. Now, most people wouldn't agree, if you said the purpose of school is to get kids to pass tests. Now most people wouldn't agree with that statement. Even most teachers, I think, wouldn't agree with that statement. But inevitably, that's what it's become. Now, because we collude. We collude around grades, we collude around tests and so forth. And we've got ourselves addicted to a set of state exams which are provided by commercial organizations. Awarding bodies, primarily all commercial organizations. So regardless of whether we have a functioning state education system or not, the monetization point is through commercial corporations. Now, that sets a challenge, because we then have a teaching community, and the majority of teachers go into teaching for absolutely the right reasons. I mean, it's about, they'll go in there to help young people become their best selves. I think that's the teachers go into teaching for that reason. Many of them leave, unfortunately, when they realise that what they actually have to do, particularly at secondary school level, but that's now creeping back into primary even, is to get young people through these tests. And so we have a standardization system, which is also a homogenizing system, where, on the one hand, we praise our species for its individuality, that every child is actually different. There's no such thing as an average child. It's a statistical myth. And yet we have deployed a system which is essentially homogenizing for this arbitrary normal. Now, if you measure, everything that you measure will become automated at some point. So if we then look at those exams that are produced by commercial organizations, and then we think, well, in order to get kids through those exams, it's really about content distribution and testing. So you've gone from a teacher whose practice has been about helping the learner contextualize knowledge, because that's what learning is. Education surely shouldn't just be a content distribution and testing system, but that's what it's become as a result of this goal. We've got one gentleman that's become quite favoritized, I think, in both in the US and the UK education system. There's a gentleman called E.D. Hirsch, who talks about foundational knowledge. And it's interesting, really, there seems to be this sort of dichotomy between what I call the instructionists and the constructionists. So constructionism and instructionism, two different things. Instructionism is about focusing on instruction and direct instruction and the communication of knowledge and the transmission of knowledge. Constructionism is saying, well, education is a reconstruction of knowledge rather than the transmission, and that's the difference. And in some sense, you probably need a bit of both, actually, in a balanced education system. But we've gone very much in this instructionism perspective, that education is the transmission of content and the testing to make sure you've understood it within a short amount of time. Whether you forget it again afterwards is neither here nor there. This makes it, by narrowing the curriculum, by assuming that it's just about content, you open up it's become standardized and therefore decontextualized, and therefore very much open to privatization. Privatization, in order to scale, in order to be profitable, requires standardization. And that means we're removing cost elements, which will mean that you end up being less inclusive. That in order for a student to game that system, in order to get to the other end of that system with a set of certificates, they have to mold themselves around the education system. So you end up with a teacher-centered or institution-centered education, as opposed to the craft of teaching, which is about molding it around the student, finding their interests and so forth, and contextualizing it so that they discover the knowledge and so forth. And these are very much competing ideologies in terms of education provision. But the idea of the constructionist, that the teacher as a designer of learning experience, as a designer of curriculum, a teacher who will know the cohort of students they're working with and allow them to solve problems and therefore receive deep learning as a result, because we remember more the things that we've done as opposed to the things that we've read. And there's a lot of research to back that up. But that level of craft in education, that level of craft in the teaching profession is expensive. These are craftspeople. These are people that once upon a time, to become a teacher, you would do a 4-year teaching degree, an education degree. That was reduced to about a year in the UK as a PGCE. So you would get a 2-1, perhaps in your degree or better. Then you do a PGCE. And to be honest, I think that many people thought that was quite short. But at least in the PGCE, you would learn about at least some learning theory about how children learn. You maybe learn about literacy. You may even learn a little bit about child psychology. But that also is becoming gone. We've had organizations, probably well-intentioned, like Teach for All, that came out of New York and the United States, and that spawned all the Teach For. So, Teach for America, for example. In the UK, it's known as Teach First. Teach First is an example where, if you've got a good degree, you've done well, at least a 2-1, hopefully a first, you can then join up to Teach First, and within 5 weeks, after a 5-week orientation, you'll find yourself in front of a classroom of children. This is to me, this is very worrying. That said, I know plenty of teachers who have gone through Teach First who are exceptional, but I think it's more to do with their ability than to do with the idea that you can become a teacher within 5 weeks. And I think we are heading towards a kind of Uberfication, if you like, the replacement of teachers, the equivalent of Uber drivers, but for teaching. And why do I think that's so? Because I think if you have an education system which is focused on delivering content and testing content, then believe that teaching is a science and it can all be measured and delivered and everything else, then it's very, it's only a leap of imagination to say, well, actually, we don't really need the teacher to be qualified. We can just deliver them a script for a lesson, and they can just deliver that to children. And certainly, if we stick to content distribution in the form of E.D. Hirsch and so forth, that's the direction that we might go, particularly as we have globally a teacher shortage, that you have multinational businesses who are very interested in maintaining the ownership of content. So if we take an organization like, let's say Pearson, for example, I just choose them because they're the largest. You look at the history of Pearson, long history, over 100 years. They were originally book publishers, textbook publishers. It was a very good idea for them, in order to make sure their textbooks were necessary and therefore to maintain their commercial interests and their value and their shareholder value, that they would own the awarding bodies. So in order to pass this test, you had to read these books. So you could see, that you could argue that was a conflict there in terms of the student, but as a business, that's a good business decision. Now what we're seeing happening with Pearson, they are now setting up chains of schools that they own. Now, so they own the school, they employ the teachers, they own the content, they own the exam. This is a closed loop system. This is a very, in my opinion, problematic for democracy. We've seen what happens, for example, with things like how Facebook and social media has affected democracy. But imagine a corporation which owns the entire programming of young people, from nursery school through to university. That's a huge amount of power to put in commercial hands. You have to be extremely careful about what we think education is for and who we allow to provide it, because at the moment I think we're heading in a potentially catastrophic direction.